What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Hoax Series. I'm your host, Tyler, joined by my co-host, James. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, James, today's topic of discussion for the Hoax is training to failure for muscle growth. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. This is probably the most simple, but also most difficult topic I think I've had to cover so far when it comes to really explaining my approach or my thoughts on this. I think it's so simple to say that I'm on the hype train for training to failure for muscle growth, because we've said in multiple episodes now that the training stimulus, if it's sufficient enough, that's what matters for hypertrophy, as long as we have some other things in line with that. James, what are your thoughts on this? But I've got some other areas that I really want to take this as well. So Hoax, training to failure for muscle growth.
So I think, again, just looking from a science standpoint, and again, I'm genuinely surprised to hear you say this, Tyler, just, looking at the university that we attend and looking at the research arm and the research data that's come from that university, which is, I think this is a pretty clear hype. So I'm interested to hear your caveats, because I think it's pretty clear that training to failure, if not the number one key, right, is one of the top, I would say, top 2 or 3 when it comes to how to elicit that hypertrophy response. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Undoubtedly, I agree. But where I have questions, not necessarily questioning does it work or not, my questions are more so, is it actually optimal to train that close or to failure in every training session? And I personally, coming from the strength and conditioning world, think that there is a lot more to consider than muscle growth all the time. And is it necessary to train to failure for muscle growth? I think that you have to weigh how much you're applying, how much stress you're applying to the system to achieve that outcome. And if you apply a little less, is it going to be that much more detrimental to hypertrophy? And I think, again, this is definitely going to be more of an opinion here, because I have not dug into the literature extensively on this. We know that training to failure provides it. I have seen in a couple of papers that if you go shy 2 to 3 reps versus failure, that the stimulus still seems sufficient enough to produce similar levels of hypertrophy. So is it worth it for that extra 2 or 3 reps every single time, every single training session on the body as a stressor? That's really where I'm coming from.
Well, and I think, again, we've got to look at a couple different factors here, which is, athletes, hypertrophy is not necessarily their most important thing, right? The only thing that matters is can they produce on the field? And if they're engaging in hypertrophy, it's usually for some specific purpose. They need to change weight class. They need to put mass on for a specific position in football. But the idea is that pro athletes don't have this ever-ending goal of getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's really the physique world, where, again, for bodybuilding, for a specific division within physique sports, of I just want to keep eliciting and keep getting this hypertrophic response. Sure. Or, one of the other populations, because we see a lot of research data on this, is the elderly, and looking at the management of sarcopenia, right, or that age-related muscle loss. So I think the data is pretty clear, though, which is, and like you said, and I'll get there when you talked about mitigating the stress on these athletes, which is, we also have to take into account the load or the intensity. So, again, do I think I should be training to failure with, 85% of my max every single session? I think you're going to grind that person into the dirt. But I think the data shows that, for example, when I do things with 40% of my max, or I'm using things like blood flow restriction, again, it's really relatively low intensity and, not that hard on the body to really train to failure and still get that hypertrophy response without really beating the athlete up. Now, the problem is that 40% of your max is probably not that useful to a football player. So again, that's not really how you'd want to get hypertrophy in them. But the science shows is that training to failure does elicit that muscle growth.
100%. Again, I will completely agree with that. Where I actually question a little bit, again, it's more just so philosophically. I understand that the central nervous system in response to really heavy loads, but in comparison to lighter loads, we said that essentially the stimulus has to be sufficient, right, for hypertrophy. It's a little different when we get into the strength power realm, the way that we look at eliciting a response for those things and how we go about doing that with managing loads. But my thing is volume acclimation is quite diverse, meaning you could go really light and go to failure. You could go pretty heavy and go to failure for hypertrophy. But the acclimation of how much is pretty similar at the end of the day. You might have to acclimate more volume if you go lighter, I think, at the end of the day. That makes sense. But at the total amount of work completed is similar between the two realms. My only thing is that really that different of a stress response on the body from a super heavy load, not taking joints into consideration. I'm referring to nervous system and neuromuscular system output. Because essentially, you go from type 1 to type 2 muscle fibers over time. You recruit those motor units. You fatigue that system. I don't know. I don't know if I fully can get on board with a heavier weight for hypertrophy versus a lighter weight for hypertrophy is a less demanding or stressing thing on the system if you're going to failure.
I mean, again, I think you'll still get that hypertrophy response, right? So we see, again, it's a whole different thing if we're talking about optimal and sport needs. But again, I think you'll see that, for example, powerlifters still put on muscle mass. Now, it's not as much as bodybuilders, and again, we're training at different loads, but we're still training to failure, and we're still seeing hypertrophy. Now, again, we're looking at optimal and sports and other demands on the athletes. And, one thing that I've seen considered, but I haven't seen in research, which is what are the psychological effects of failing every single workout?
Oh, couldn't imagine. Couldn't imagine putting my athletes through failing all the time. There's a certain amount. It's a great point. So I'm going to let you continue, but you kind of cut me before I was going to eventually work there. I love you.
Right. Well, and I think that's the thing, right, is we're of this same mind that, again, if you're training someone and you have to look at the whole person, right, is that psychological aspect, which is just every single workout you're failing, right? You push yourself until I just can't do it anymore. And again, depending on if you're doing forced reps or negatives, I mean, again, you have the physical damage, but two, it's just this, how long can I do this? Can I keep doing this? And so
100%.
Again, I'm going to stay with hype from the science standpoint, which is we know that training to failure elicits hypertrophy. But, those caveats being, if you're playing a sport and you're not just interested in working out for recreation, there's a whole lot of other factors. And I would not just blanket statement say everyone should train to failure. I don't think you can say that, but I do think the science is clear and we should be hyping it up that training to failure does elicit a hypertrophic response.
Beautiful. I like that. I'm gonna spice it up a little bit. I'm still gonna stick with hype, meaning does it work on the bench? So bench meaning in research. Yes, it works. Do I think that it is the optimal way for long-term hypertrophy and long-term management of the system as a whole in being able to continue to do this thing for a long time? Nope. I really don't. I honestly do not. I do not think it's optimal for the long term and that it's a sustainable thing if you are going super hard in all your sessions, regardless of load. So take the load irrespectively, take that out of it. If you're training to failure, regardless of the load all the time, I feel like there's going to be a burnout at some point, or potentially that risk of injury continues to increase over time, depending on the mechanics. So that's a personal philosophical approach. I think you can go a couple reps shy of that failure piece and still get similar results without that increase in risk. So